Hello, everybody. Welcome to Application Development Virtual Group Webinar. My name is Sarah Huang. I'm the co-organizer of this virtual group. Join me here is Debbie Huang, our co-organizer. Today, Eugene Meidinger will present what's new in SQL Server 2019. Eugene works as a BI consultant and a full-time Pluralsight author. He currently focuses on contents on Power BI and related products. He also leads the Pittsburgh Power BI user group. He is certified in querying and administering SQL Server. We really appreciate Eugene shares his knowledge with us on a Saturday night. Let me first take care of a few housekeeping things from past, then I'll transfer screens over to Eugene. Right now, PASS Summit 2019 is calling for speakers, and there will be over 200 sessions to give the audience so that you will be confident to modernize your database and your skills as a data professional at the summit. And past marathon this time, the topic is for open source. This will take place on July 30th. And past Facebook Live upcoming event is hosted by, it will be hosted by Lila on Wednesday, July 24th. And she's a Microsoft AI MVP and data platform, and I guess she has a bunch of other titles. For past Summit 2019, when you register for this event as a participant of our virtual group, which is an application development virtual group, you can save $150 of your registration fee. And please use the code VGDISHX2H when you register, and your savings will be calculated at the time of the registration. So these are upcoming virtual group webinars, and this is the other ones are already passed. The last one is ours. And then on this page, there are Global Hebrew DBA fundamentals, cloud DevOps, and as again, we have another session on the August 3rd, because they're use UAT. It's a Saturday also at the same time. So the title is "You Should Use a Column Store, but Avoid the Mistakes I Made." And then there are more sessions from Cloud DBA Fundamentals, Data Architect, and more cloud. And as you may know already, PASS has many virtual groups. You may join as many as you like, and PASS membership is completely free. As always, you're more than welcome to join our virtual group, which is the first one, Application Development. And these are the upcoming SQL Saturday events. And PASS has a career center. If you are a job hunter or an employer wanting to post a job, you can always visit pass.org/careers to get more information. And this is how you may connect with PASS through Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, and Instagram. Yes. Okay. And this is how you may ask questions during our webinar. you may raise your hand by click this little hand sign if you would like to interact directly with Eugene, or you may post your questions in this little chat window, and I'll read the questions to Eugene. All right, that's all I have. Now I'm gonna transfer screen over to. Oops. Give me a second.
Oh, no problem.
Sorry. For some reason I couldn't find this thing.
I think you have
Yeah.
to make me a presenter, maybe? Oh, no.
Yes. All right. Okay.
There we go. Okay.
I can see a screen now.
Okay. I think that, yeah, it should be showing monitor 1. Are you able to see that?
Yeah, I can see a screen.
Great. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about is what's new in SQL Server 2019. My name's Eugene Meidinger, and I work as a business intelligence consultant. So SQL Server is no longer kind of my core focus, but I still thought this would be a good way to learn about SQL Server and an interesting topic to present on. One of the most important lines here is that I used to be a SQL noob. So I work for myself now, but my last job started about 7 or 8 years ago. And at the time, I didn't know I didn't know what a view was. I didn't know what a database function was. I didn't know what a stored procedure was. And I did a lot of learning on the job. And about halfway through, suddenly I became a consultant. We had an IT company and they bought another IT company, and the salespeople said, oh, well, we have a SQL guy now. And so there was a good amount of time that I spent doing SQL health checks and other things for customers, and long-term kind of pivoted into Power BI and that kind of stuff. So even though SQL Server is not my day-to-day as much, I still find it interesting what all the new features and things that they're adding in. And so feel free to ask questions during the presentation, and if I don't have the answer, I'm more than happy to get back to you and find the answer. So enough about me. What are we actually going to cover? What are we going to talk about? So we're going to go through a handful of sections, and I think really there's maybe a dozen things that are worth covering in this presentation. A lot of the stuff that they've been adding is little quality of life stuff, or I've been seeing a lot of things for graph and for SQL big data clusters, or say Linux, but not necessarily a ton of things that if you're an application developer are going to be affecting you. There's a handful of things that you're going to be like, this is awesome. So the first thing we're going to talk about is performance improvements. So what changes have they made that'll make your queries run faster just right out of the box? Then we're going to talk about kind of the more administrative side with availability and security. Going to talk a little bit about SQL Server on Linux, although whenever I give this presentation, I ask for a show of hands. I don't see a lot of people who are using SQL Server on Linux in production, but we'll talk a little bit about that. There's some miscellaneous features that don't really fit anywhere particularly well. And we'll wrap up with a little bit about SQL Server Big Data Edition, and then we'll have demos for a lot of these things. So the first thing is performance improvements. As an application developer, this is probably where you're going to be most excited. And so one of those performance improvements is scalar UDF inlining. So that might sound like a bit of gibberish. The way to kind of break that down is scalar. The way that I always think about that is you can have a vector in math, which is 2 or 3 different numbers that represent a direction. But you can also have a scalar, which is a single number that you multiply stuff by. And so when I hear scalar functions, to me that means it returns a single value. And UDF stands for user design function or user develop function, something like that. And it used to be that there was a real big conflict between the way that we learn to do things as programmers and the way that we should do things in SQL Server. Because if any of you out there took a computer science course, your professor would have beat into you, hey, don't repeat yourself, the dry principle. And so, well, how do we avoid repeating ourselves? How do we avoid writing code over and over again to do the same thing? We write functions, we write classes. And so if you're coming from a procedural or imperative or object-oriented kind of perspective, you may come to SQL and go, look, oh, I can make functions and just save time and effort. The problem is that scalar functions used to be just terrible for performance. They would prevent queries from going parallel. They were kind of a black box. You would ask SQL Server, how many rows do you think that's going to return? And it would say, maybe one. Just really wasn't particularly good. And they've changed it now. So effectively, even though you're calling a function, it's as if you wrote that code in line in the query itself. And so we get better performance that way. Another thing that they've added is adaptive query processing just across the board, but one of those is dynamic memory grants. And so sometimes SQL Server isn't the best about predicting how much memory a query is actually going to need. And you want to get the memory grant right, because if it grants too much memory, then you're going to be blocking other queries that are waiting for their chance to get some memory. And if it gives too little memory, then you have a chance that it's going to spill to TempDB, or you're just going to run into some other kind of issue whenever the query processor realizes that it needs more memory than was initially granted. So one of the nice things is that now it'll run a query and then it'll keep an eye on it. And if it requested more memory than it actually needed, the second time it'll say, well, did it still overcommit? And then the third time, if that's the case, then it's going to adjust how much memory it's going to give based on that execution plan. Another change is batch execution mode. So this used to be only available if you were dealing with column store indexes. And so the thing with batch execution mode is that sometimes if you're developing an analytical application, then your query patterns are going to be very different than an online transactional application. So think about an accounting system. So if I place an order and we need to put it in the accounting system, we're going to be adding a single entry in a header table and then some lines in a line item table. And so we're going to be dealing with a few rows at a time, right? Reading and modifying and that sort of thing a lot of times in a lot of tables. Whereas data warehouses are more analytical kinds of structures. You're going to be dealing with these big centralized fact tables, and you're going to be pulling potentially entire columns or large chunks of a column. Think about how maybe the CFO, she wants to know, okay, how's my company doing year over year? What's our year over year growth? And so that means looking at lots and lots of entries, but oftentimes it just means a few columns, right? So maybe it's whatever you're filtering on, and then the columns you want to do your aggregates on. So it's part of why they created column store indexes, but part of that is batch execution mode, which basically says, okay, instead of going row by agonizing row, we're going to grab 100 rows or 1,000 rows at a time, just get these bigger chunks of data. And so now, even if you're doing a regular kind of row-based query, that batch execution mode is available to you now. So we'll have a demo for that. And so you can see a definite performance improvement when you're doing more analytical style queries, especially if you have a lot of data. Now we start veering into the kind of stuff. And so we have approximate distinct count. So as you can imagine, distinct count, you can't parallelize that, right? Because I could give you a novel, say The Lord of the Rings, and I could say, okay, I want to know how many times the word elf shows up in that book. And what I could do is I could split that book into fifths and hand 1/5 out to each of you, and then you could count it, give me back the number, and I could combine it, right? So it's something that kind of task can be split out. But I can't split it out if I want to say, well, how many different words were used? How big was Tolkien's vocabulary, right? And so approximate distinct count basically does some statistical magic behind the scenes, because we already have a lot of that information, and is able to give us a value that supposedly on average is going to be within 1 or 2% margin of error. I believe that Microsoft said that it can be up to 10% or somewhere around there in the worst case. Um, so interesting, but I don't know how many people are going to be making use of this. Um, and then another thing is lightweight polling for query progress. So back in, I want to say SQL Server 2016, they added uh, live query statistics for execution plans. So you could watch a query as it was processing. And so now they've made it so that we're able to do that in a way that limits the performance impact. And this is also available to us via extended events. So interesting. I don't know how many people are taking advantage of that. So those are some of the most relevant kind of performance improvements. So talking about availability, the accelerated database recovery, this is a big deal. So if you were in a situation where you had an application that had long running transactions, then if you had a situation where someone accidentally pulled out a power cord or you had to restore from backup or what have you, then it used to be that the database engine had to do a lot of work to deal with those long running transactions, so it could take a very long time to recover. So now they've changed it so that you can enable accelerated database recovery. And so it's writing some extra information that allows it to skip ahead, essentially. So we'll have a slide on that. But this is actually pretty exciting if you've got that kind of scenario. Now we've got resumable online index maintenance. So it used to be you could do online index maintenance, you could do a rebuild before, but now it's something where you can pause it and resume it if maybe you've exceeded your maintenance window. They've also added column store online index build and rebuild. And again, if you're dealing with more of an analytical type database or application, this could really be useful. With always on availability groups, they've added, so now you can have 5 synchronous replicas. I am terrified to think of who has who would need 5 synchronous replicas. I feel like that's going to be going really slow, but it's available now. They've got secondary replica connection redirection. So what this means is that now you don't need a listener. You don't need a SQL listener. You don't need that third IP address, because if you're pointing at the secondary, you can automatically get redirected. So that's pretty interesting. But talking a little bit more about accelerated database recovery. So this is from Microsoft, and it used to be that, okay, we've got our uncommitted transactions. So somebody, maybe they were playing around or doing a delete and they wanted to test things first. And so they say begin transaction, and then they do whatever they're going to do, and then maybe they get distracted and go get some coffee or something like that. And the database does a checkpoint. It's saving information to the log, and then, okay, the power goes out, or we need to do a restore or something like that. So it used to be that first it would start the last checkpoint, and it would do analysis to figure out, okay, what actually finished? What was still running when everything stopped, or what finished? And then anything that actually finished, or it has to redo it, and then anything that didn't finish, it has to undo it, right? So again, you can see that it goes back to the oldest uncommitted transaction. So if you have something that's been running for hours, this could substantially impact how quickly you can recover. But with accelerated database recovery, it's writing non-version operations to the secondary log. And so it doesn't have to deal with most of that redo or any of that undo. It's just able to scan between the last checkpoint and the end of the log. And so it can be much, much faster. So again, if you're more of a database administrator, this can be particularly exciting. So security, privacy. They added static data masking and then they removed it. So I don't know what's going on with that, because they added it and then they pulled it out of SQL Server Management Studio. So I don't know if that came back or it's coming back, but this was actually exciting because dynamic data masking isn't a true security feature. It's more of a security through obscurity or PI minimization kind of thing. But the problem with dynamic data masking is there were ways around it. You know, you could do things where basically, even though it prevent you from seeing the values, you could still do joins. And so in theory, you could join to say an alphabet table and kind of rework backwards the values that were there. So static data masking is different because you're exporting a copy of the data, and it's a lot like whenever you buy something on the receipt, it's got a bunch of X's and then the last four of your credit card number. You could do the same sort of thing with static data masking. So this is great for dev and QA. So I don't know what's going on with this, but they added it and they pulled it out, and hopefully they add it back. Um, we've got support for secure enclaves for always encrypted. I suspect that very few, maybe one of you, is using always encrypted because it's not like transparent data encryption that encrypts your data at rest. Always encrypted, it encrypts your data everywhere, in flight, at rest, all that kind of stuff. And basically kind of assumes that your data is living somewhere that you can't trust the infrastructure, right? So maybe you're worried about the DBAs, maybe you're worried about um, some malicious third party or something like that. But they added support for secure enclaves, which are basically these kind of co-processors designed specifically for this sort of thing. So now we can get in-place encryption and rich comparisons. So if you're using always encrypted, this is useful if you have access to the hardware necessary. Otherwise, you know, it's pretty niche, and that's what you're going to find if you search for what's new in SQL Server 2019. The first result is the documentation from Microsoft, and you go through, and a lot of these things are just little bits of polish, little things, not a ton of blockbuster exciting stuff. This isn't like SQL Server 2016. It's more like an incremental SQL Server 2017. You know, just tiny little tweaks here and there. Um, they've added support for certificate management and configuration manager. This is nice, but again, nothing to write home about. Um, so Linux is kind of interesting. When they first announced support for SQL Server on Linux, I didn't get it. I really didn't understand why they were doing that because I just didn't see the Venn diagram of people using Linux and wanting to use SQL Server. Like, were they trying to compete with Oracle, which I could kind of see? But you know, how many of those people migrating from Oracle to Linux or SQL Server aren't just going to make the jump with the operating system? Were they trying to target people using free MySQL and Postgres? Yeah, I didn't quite see it. But now I get it because SQL Server big data clusters depends on a lot of this technology. But all the demos I'm going to do today are going to be on SQL Server on Linux. My most recent blog post is about that because when you're dealing with a CTP like this, it's such a pain to uninstall and reinstall. But with Docker containers, it's super quick. Um, so with Linux, some of the things that they've added replication support. I feel bad for anyone who's having to deal with replication and Linux. But they've added broad support for that. They've added support for Open LDAP, so now you've got better support for dealing with Active Directory and that sort of thing. Support for machine learning services. There's more images available. They now have support for availability groups, which is really, really interesting. Because before you had to do your clusters with stuff like Pacemaker and more Linux native sort of things. So this is kind of interesting. They added support for the distributed transaction coordinator. Bunch of stuff, but again, I feel like maybe one of you is actually going to be impacted by this. So finally, we've got some other features. So the feature I am the most excited about, because this would have saved me hours and hours of time at my last job, is string or binary data would be truncated. Because what would happen is I my original boss was a vice president, and his opinion on SQL Server or SQL was it was like driving a car. You only needed a professional if you're going 200 miles per hour. Now I begged to differ, but and so a lot of times what would happen is we would have something called Dynamics Great Plains. It's a ERP accounting piece of software, and we would do things that would get us arrested for crimes against humanity with that system because we would just take raw data from line of business applications, just shove it in there. And most of the time it worked, and sometimes it didn't. And sometimes we would get a customer that had a really long business name, and then the ETL would break because it was just SQL agent jobs and views stacked on views. And I would have to figure out, well, what broke, and the error message was useless because it would just say, well, something was too big. Wouldn't tell you where, wouldn't tell you what. Well, now it'll tell you what column and what value was being inserted up to the size of the column you're inserting into. So if it's a 2-character column and you're trying to insert something real big, you're out of luck. But this would have saved me hours and hours of time at my last job. They've added UTF-8 support. Uh, this can provide better data sizes, but for an extremely limited set of scenarios, it really only makes sense if like 99.9% of your data is in kind of the original ASCII first 128 characters. It also can might potentially be useful for people that need to kind of take a legacy application that was designed for just your basic char kind of characters or varchar without any international characters, and now you need to add international support. But you're probably not going to benefit from this too much. They added Java code support. They're expanding Polybase and the connectors it can talk to. This is going to be extremely relevant when we talk about SQL Server Big Data Edition. So these are some random features. Again, there's some stuff that I'm super excited about. Most of those we have demos for, and then there's a lot of little things, and there's probably 20 different things I didn't even put on these slides, but they're little stuff like SQL Graph has support now for shortest path, right? I doubt it's going to be something that's impacting a lot of you, but so there's a lot of things you can check out the documentation, but we're again just kind of covering the big highlights. So SQL Server Big Data Edition, this is interesting. And like I said, it's kind of like with SQL Server on Linux, I didn't get it at the time, and now I'm starting to get it. But this is interesting because it feels it feels a little bit like Microsoft said, okay, we keep hearing all these buzzwords, so we need to just like throw them all together into SQL Server. So first you have your data living in the Hadoop file system. So this is really, really common, even if you don't use kind of core Hadoop, if you're not using MapReduce or anything like that. With modern data warehousing, modern data engineering, there's a good chance that your data might live in the Hadoop file system or something that's compatible with that. So if you're using Azure Data Lake, that supports Web HDFS, for example. So this is pretty standard. The two languages, the two flavors that you're going to be dealing with for your data manipulation is SQL and Apache Spark. And Apache Spark is really, really popular for kind of data engineering for these ETL processes. Querying takes advantage of Polybase, and so what that means is that you've got data virtualization. You can access the data where it lives instead of having to conglomerate it all in one single place. On top of that, this is all running in Linux containers, and it's organized by Kubernetes. So for those of you who are not super familiar with Kubernetes, when you think about Linux containers, the idea is that they're supposed to be disposable. You think about, okay, well, I want to do an update for SQL Server on Linux. If they're in containers, what you do is you spin up a new copy and you just get rid of the old one, right? Instead of having to patch things, you just spin up a new copy. And the ideal is this kind of catchphrase of cattle, not pets, right? And when I was a DBA, I get it. My SQL Server is a pet. It's got a name, it's got a special bed. We don't touch anything because we don't want anything to go wrong, right? But in the container world, if they're going to be disposable, they're not going to have names. You're not going to be statically specifying names. They're not going to have static IPs. You're going to need an orchestration platform to manage all that. So when you say, I want to talk to SQL, Kubernetes says where you actually need to go. So these are all the components of SQL Server Big Data Edition. And if you've been working with big data up to this point, especially kind of more the open source side, a lot of these names should sound familiar, or even if you've been doing some of the data processing stuff in Azure. So let's take a look a little bit about how these kind of connect together. So there's a lot going on here, but there's just a couple things that I wanna highlight. Uh, so the first thing is that from a user perspective, they're all going to be talking to this master instance. So they're not going to need to worry about all this stuff going on behind the scenes. So that's the first thing. And so you've got this cluster. And what's interesting, and they've been doing this with a lot of the cloud database kind of pieces, is that the compute layer is separated from the storage layer. And so this is interesting because that means you can scale those up independently of each other. If you need more compute, you just spin up another compute node. Um, and you think about it, doing that with SQL Server today is a giant pain. If you've got physical hardware, you're completely out of luck. And then, if you've got virtual hardware, you can do that to a certain degree. You can do that with some virtual machines, or you could maybe scale out with a read-only secondary or something like that. Um, but in this instance, the scalability is really interesting. I already mentioned before about the kind of data virtualization, but the idea is that not all of your data has to live there. And so what ends up happening is that Spark and SQL Server, or Spark and T-SQL, kind of become this thin veneer on top of your data, wherever it is, in whatever format it is. And so I like to think of it as kind of this lingua franca sort of thing. So it's basically SQL, the T-SQL as a service. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but I think it's pretty interesting. Um, all right, so now we're gonna jump into demos. We're about halfway through. Before I do that, do we have any questions from the attendees?
Let me take a look. We probably got one. Oh, a couple.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is about us. Well, this session is recorded, and I will post the recording to our website later on, probably by
Awesome.
tomorrow. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay, cool. So then we will jump into demos. Um, so, like I said, before we actually do any of the demos, something kind of relevant, I guess, two things. So one, let me see if I remember. One of the things that's interesting in the latest version of SQL Server Management Studio is I can click on a database and I can say, all right, I want to run a query in Azure Data Studio. And so you can kind of see how the two are designed to be more complements. Azure Data Studio is much quicker to be uh, extended, enhanced, all this kind of stuff. And so you're going to see a lot of the innovation going on. You're going to see a lot of the innovation going on in Azure Data Studio. But another thing that I want to point out is you can support a lot of different languages and things. Um, Let me see real quick. So I can do select one. So I can run a SQL query. But in addition to that, we can see here that I've got the Docker extension. And what I'm going to be running against is I'm running against an Ubuntu container that's running CTP 3.0. Now, 3.1 is out. I checked. There's nothing relevant for these demos that's different with that. But honestly, getting that set up, it's a few lines of code, and it's about as fast as it takes to download the material. Once the installation bits are downloaded, it literally takes seconds to spin up a new container. So some really interesting stuff there. So let's kind of jump into the actual demos. um, if anyone has trouble seeing, just let me know and I can expand the text. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a temporary table called long string. And actually, I might have made that last name too long. All right. Well, worst case, we'll add some spaces to my last name. How about that? Okay, and so let's say I try to insert into them, and all the cool people have 4-letter last names, right? Bob Ward, Brent Ozar, Joe Sack. So I'm not particularly cool. So if I try to insert, uh, hold on. Let's try this again. So I should be getting an error because my name is way too long. There we go. Okay. So we've got string or binary data would be truncated in table long string. And normally that would be all that you would get, which would be really, really frustrating because if you've got a 50 column table, it's going to take a long time to figure out where the problem is. But now in SQL Server 2019, we can actually see what column it tried to insert to, and then the truncated value. So it doesn't give you all of the information, but it's definitely a much better start. Another interesting thing is that there's a trace flag 460, that if you're up to date on your patches for SQL Server 2017, you can turn this on and get the same functionality. So pretty happy about that. So next, we've got approximate count distinct and count distinct. And so we can see that the difference here is about 30. And so that's pretty much a 1%, a little bit less than a 1% difference. So if you've got a situation where you don't need exact distinct counts, you can get a little bit better performance that way. We can see that here, our query cost, we've got a 2-to-1 ratio between the precise way and the imprecise way. If we had more data, I'm sure it'd be even a starker contrast. Now it's worth mentioning, what is that cost in? So for those of you who don't know, this cost is kind of an arbitrary number, right? Let's see. So my subtree cost is 1.12, and then here for this one, my subtree cost is 1.98. And again, kind of the question is 1.12 what? And the answer is 1.12 seconds on a computer under a Microsoft employee's desk back in like 1999 or some such. It's baseline on an estimate. And so, it doesn't mean a ton today, but it's still relevant because you've got settings like cost threshold for parallelism that look at that cost and determine whether or not to go parallel. So just be aware that the query cost can be useful for comparison, but it's not some sort of firm figure. So another feature we have is we've got adaptive memory grant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rebuild an index to basically just flesh out my execution plans and everything. And so I've got this query here that is going to ask for more memory than it needs. Because what's going on is it's ordering by comment, which is this big text field, as well as some other things. But I only am pulling the first 101 rows. I'm not doing a ton. So if I run this, I can take a look at the execution plan, and I can go to memory grant info, and we can see something interesting. So it says I want 16,920 presumably bytes, I'm assuming. So about 17 kilobytes. And there's this new field here that says, is memory grant feedback adjusted? It says, no, this is the first execution. So what I should be able to do, sometimes this can be a little bit tricky, but let's try it. What I should be able to do is run this again. and it should hopefully have changed. Okay, so now it says, yes, adjusting. So it doesn't automatically say, oh, well, you requested more memory than you needed and force it there. Um, Instead, what it does is it watches it to see if there's variability in how much memory it actually needs. So now if we run it one more time, uh, we can see that it says yes, stable. And now instead of asking for 17 kilobytes, it's asking for 11. So now it's the SQL engine has determined that the query is stable, and now it's giving it a dynamic memory grant, so it's not taking up as much memory as maybe it initially wanted. So again, this can improve performance because more accurate memory grants mean more queries can run at the same time and less of them are going to spill to disk. So here we've got UDF inlining. So I'm going to go to AdventureWorks and I'm going to, oh, sorry, this mouse is a little bit of a troublemaker. So I'm going to create a function that's not particularly exciting. It's going to determine discount, and it's basically going to take quantity times price minus discount. Pretty straightforward. And it looks like I already have that there. So now, I have it in the old compatibility mode. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run two of these queries side by side. And so in the first one, I've just inlined that code, right? It's just part of the query. Whereas in this one, we've got a UDF, we've got a scalar function. And so, hold on, what is, oh, I was wondering why the first 100%. So we can see that the second one is a little bit more expensive. There's situations where you can get minutes, even tens of minutes of a difference. But the most important part in this case is we can see that the first one is able to go parallel, right? Those little yellow arrows mean that it's able to go parallel, but the second one is not able to, and it's because of that user-defined function, right? So if this was a bigger query that didn't take just a few seconds, the lack of parallelism could be a big problem. So now, if we change it back to latest compatibility mode, and we run the same thing as before, we can see that the plans are identical. They're identical in cost, they're identical in how they work, they're completely identical. And that's because, again, it basically inlined that code for us. So it's as if we wrote it in there by hand, but we can still get the benefit of encapsulating our logic. Okay, so now we've got batch mode. So okay, so I've got this query that's doing a lot of aggregates. So it's looking at all the data. And if I go to this index scan, we can see that the actual execution mode is row, and then the lapse time is 1/6 of a second. I'm going to run that a second time just in case it's loading stuff into memory, because I want to get, okay, so about 1/2 a second. So now if we change the compatibility mode, let me see if that matches it right. Okay. So now if we run it, we can see the actual execution mode is batch, and we can see that instead of taking 1/2 of a second, it took about 1/3. Now, because this is such a small amount of data, I mean, it's not a stark difference. But again, if you were dealing with gigabytes of data instead of megabytes of data, then you would definitely notice a difference there when you're doing these kind of analytical queries where it's lots and lots of aggregates over, whole columns or big chunks of them. Um, but um, yeah, okay. And so now we've got one last demo. So UTF-8, SQL Quantum has a really interesting query where they map out how much space something takes with the normal way that nvarchars are stored and with UTF-8. And so normally the the values in when you do a nvarchar, it takes 2 bytes, right? So it's this UTF-16. And so for your basic code points, where we're dealing with kind of our classic ASCII kind of stuff, so let's get to the actual letters and things. UTF is able to represent just that number, and so you get a savings of a byte per character, right? Whereas UTF-16, you can see the zeros, you can see that extra space. But you only get that savings for the first 128 character options, right? And then at that point, they're on par because they're both taking up 2 bytes. Now, you can see that how they're stored are slightly different, right? Um, and so that's all good and fine for a while. But then as you start to get into some of the further code points later on, UTF-8 actually starts to take up more space. So let's see. So for the first 2048 or so, it's it's comparable. So the first 128 characters, you're saving space. Then up to 2048, it's the same. And then after that, if you're dealing with any kind of foreign script languages or something like that, now you're actually taking up more space. Um, so there's a very limited number of scenarios where um, you're really going to want to go with UTF-8. So yeah, I think that is all of the demos that I had for today. So do we have any questions from anybody?
I haven't seen anything, but would you be able to explain the static IP you mentioned earlier versus the dynamic one?
Yeah. So with containers,
Mm-hmm.
that whole thing? Or
Right.
yeah, sure. So um so I've got this container that's been spun up. And the the idea is that I can run multiple containers on the same host. And they're really, really quick to create. So if I were to like pull up the code to create, I could create in a few seconds. Um, and so the goal is to have it that these things are disposable, right? So I can just blow away a container and spin up a new one and that sort of thing. And that disposability runs contrary to what we're used to when we think about SQL Server or servers in general. What we're used to are servers that are very static, very stationary. You assign it a name, you assign it um, a static IP, all that kind of stuff. But for something like this, I haven't assigned it an IP. Instead, what I'm doing to connect to it in this particular case is I'm connecting to localhost and then I'm connecting to a port that's being mapped to port 1433, right? So I'm connecting to port 10,001 but that's being remapped to, the application that's living inside of that container. And so when you start to shift to this kind of mindset, I recommend everyone here check out the Phoenix Project. It's a really great book about DevOps. Um, then you need some way to figure out where your services are living, right? What host is it on? What port am I pointing to? All that kind of stuff. And so the idea is that Kubernetes provides an orchestration layer that's able to help manage these containers, because maybe, here I have a container for SQL. Maybe I would have a different container for my web application. Maybe I would have another container for logging or something like that. And what hosts they're on could change. Or maybe I have a bunch of containers and they're providing high availability or round robin or something like that. Um, and so Kubernetes is a way of managing all of that so that you can have a system that's more robust or is self-healing. Because there's that joke with Windows machines that if it's not working, you reboot it, right? Well, with Kubernetes, you can literally have it where if there's some sort of problem with one of your services that's running a container, you can have it just literally shut down the container and just spin up a new one instead of having to try and troubleshoot the issue. So you can get systems that are self-healing potentially, that sort of thing. So yeah, so the point I was just making is that whenever you want to start trying to understand what's going on with SQL Server Big Data Edition, it's important to understand that these nodes may not have, you know, static IPs and names like we're used to with virtual machines, but instead may have dynamic IPs or dynamic ports or all those things that are going to be managed by Kubernetes in that master instance. So yeah, it's a good question.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have anything else, or we wrap
Let's
up a little bit early?
see. I thought I saw one. Well, this may be outside the the
Sure,
topic you
that's
just
fine.
presented. I was just wondering if, like, well, not only just the SQL Server 2019, but just in general, say like
Hmm.
SQL Server 2012 even. Do you have to have like a Microsoft Office installed, or just Excel installed on the server in order to import the data? Uh, like the source is Microsoft Excel. Basically, you know,
Hmm.
uh, when you import the data from the Excel file, do
Hmm.
you have to have Microsoft Excel installed on the server, like either on premise
So,
or in the cloud?
right. To my knowledge, no, you don't need uh, to license Excel to be able to read Excel files with SQL Server or anywhere else. To my understanding, I could be wrong on that, but first I know with Power BI and Power Query in particular, it's able to read without needing any of that licensing. I wouldn't be surprised if you had the same thing with SQL Server. Usually, when you're dealing with like Access or Excel files, I think, I forget what the ODBC driver is called. I think it's like ACE or JET or something like that, but it's a redistributable file. So yeah, to my knowledge, if you want to be pulling in data like that, you don't need a copy of Excel on the server or licensed in particular, to my understanding.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Uh, yeah, there's another question here. Is that could you give a little
Great.
more detail about SQL master instance?
Um, yeah, unfortunately, I don't know a ton about the SQL master instance. My general understanding is that from an application perspective, you're going to be able to point it to just one place, just like how today, if you've got multiple instances on a SQL server, the SQL browser takes care of that for you. Or if you have uh, SQL Server availability groups, then you point it at the SQL listener, and that takes care of that for you. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if it's something similar to Hadoop or other massively parallel processing kind of solutions where you've got sort of a name node or a head node, and then you've got a bunch of worker nodes that are doing the work, and the name node or the head node is what's interfacing with the application and collecting all the work from the worker nodes. But unfortunately, no, I don't know a ton in specific on that that master instance. But it's a good
Uh,
question. I'll make sure my email is available, and I'll be if necessary, I'll be happy to find some more information on that for you.
yeah, I guess he's referring to like how NoSQL and SQL database cluster together for that question, the master instance question. Well,
Hmm.
um, so another quick question is that,
Yeah,
well, this is probably outside this topic as well.
sure.
um,
No, it's fine.
yeah, I mean, this is something that we ran into, and well,
Hmm.
we have like a Excel report,
Hmm.
and when I added some columns, we have some views and
Hmm.
that used by the Excel report. And when I add some extra columns to a table, even though the view itself is not using those columns, or later on we even tried to add it to the uh, to the view as the data source for the Excel report, but it was working until we added those columns, and then the entire report stopped working, and then we had to delete those columns one by one, then add it back, which made it work. But I just don't understand why, when add columns to a table, it's an underlying table of a view, which is a data source of an Excel file,
Right.
Excel report, and for some reason the report just doesn't work. It just doesn't recognize that connection.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't have a good answer. I've run into something similar with linked servers
Hmm.
and had to like do free proc cache on the specific metadata or something like that. It's been a long time, but yeah, I
Hmm.
don't. Fortunately for that one, I definitely don't have a good answer.
Okay, cool. That's okay. I was just thinking, the connection is that similar to the Power BI ones, or Power BI is using the gateway. I think Power BI is using a gateway, right?
Um,
For data
yeah,
connections.
yes, yep.
Right.
If
But
you've got your, yep,
hmm yeah, but the Excel is what kind of connection? I don't think it's a gateway, right? It's
I
not,
don't think
right?
so. Yeah,
Okay.
usually it's just, yeah, yep.
Okay. Cool. I think anybody else have questions?
Looks like there was one last one about for
Oh,
me. Sorry, which features we should focus on as a BI developer or analyst?
oh yeah, cool. Yes.
Um, yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that's a good one to kind of wrap up with. Um, so my general kind of recommendation with that is I found that a disproportionate amount of my work is in data cleansing and kind of the basics of data modeling, enough to kind of get by, right? So understanding headers and details and granularity and normal form, those sorts of things. But I think if you're looking to lean into business intelligence, um, you want to know enough to be able to make things pretty, but you're going to find that a lot of your actual work and a lot of your pain points are in the data cleansing and data preparation piece. So that's kind of what I would focus on. All right. Well, it looks like we're right at 10 o'clock. Um, oh, and yeah, someone asked if I'll share my slides. Um, I will do that. So tomorrow I've got I will upload them. I've got on my blog at sqlgene.com, I've got an engagements page. So I will update my past presentations with this one and post the slides there. Great question.
Okay, cool. Can you send me that link so I can, post it on our website
Yeah.
as well? Okay,
Yeah, perfect.
wonderful.
I can definitely do that. I will get
Okay,
that done tomorrow. Awesome.
okay, cool. Thank you so much, Eugene. This is a very informative.
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I learned a lot. Yeah, I'm sure everybody else feel the same. Thank you so much for coming back and present us and present and the
Yeah, you're very
information.
welcome.
Yeah. Then this session is recorded and I'll post it on our website tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next at our October event. Thank
All
you,
right.
Eugene,
Bye.
and thank you everybody. Bye.